To another episode of Beyond 28. I'm your host, Marc Spears from ESPN's The Undefeated. And about 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to meet a very, very interesting man, very instrumental man, a very important Black man to this country, to this world. Derrick Johnson, the president and CEO of the NAACP. Derrick Johnson, welcome to Beyond 28, man.
Oh, good to be on.
Yeah, man. I met you in San Francisco with our good friend Prakash, who started Next Door, and I think you were in Oakland, California for the Afrotech convention.
Yeah, I had come over to Afrotech, and Prakash and I had met maybe 6 months prior, and I told him I'd come out to West Coast. I was going to hang out with him and called him, and that's when we connected. He wanted me to meet, I think you, his wife, and a few other people. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm glad I got that opportunity, man, and hopefully we see you in a better world soon in a lot of ways, right?
Oh yeah, it's amazing. It was maybe 6 months before the pandemic.
And you know what I remember about that? You probably don't remember this. I think I was driving from San Francisco, driving you guys to Oakland to hang out. And I remember I was sick.
Oh yeah.
I dropped y'all off and kept it moving. I was like, man, and I think I had just gotten back from India, maybe.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So, yeah, man, maybe I had something before. I don't know. But we're here now. We're healthy now. And welcome to Beyond 28, man. So, hey, look, I got a lot talk to you about, man, and definitely always enjoy your wisdom. But so let's get right into it. My first question is, last week you had an opportunity to meet with President Biden to discuss voting rights with other civil rights leaders. He had just delivered one of the most passionate speeches of his presidency. He called for a new coalition to be formed to push back on voting laws. My question, though, is what do you see in addition to these powerful words? Are you seeing enough action behind Biden's speech?
Yeah, have a coalition to push back. I don't understand what that means, quite honestly. What we're looking at is the U.S. Senate. They have the opportunity to adopt public policy to stop the rash of vote suppression efforts. But in the Senate, they are allowing a procedural rule to prevent them from addressing a substantive constitutional right to ensure that the democracy we learned about, we expect to have, is a democracy that we actually can participate in practice. Policymakers, elected officials should not be in the position of selecting their voters. It is the responsibility in a true democracy for voters to elect the policymakers or elected officials.
Yeah. Next, I want to ask you about, there's many leaders in this current political environment. And the only way to stop this onslaught from the GOP is to get rid of the filibuster and allow legislation to pass with a narrow majority. What is your belief? Can there be meaningful change in an extremist GOP continues to stop any and all expansion of voter rights?
Now, if you understand the history of this country, particularly in the Senate, the procedural rule of the filibuster was used in the 30s, 40s, 50s to impede progress. It was used by Southern Democrats who were segregationists, first to stop the full implementation of Brown versus Board of Education, Civil Rights Bill, Voting Rights Bill. It was perfected. It allowed them to create these structural systems of deficits that we know. The reason why for decades African Americans did not qualify for Social Security is because Southern senators on adoption of that bill said they can only support it if agricultural and domestic workers were exempt. Well, 80% of African Americans at that time were domestic or agricultural workers. Or when you look at in the 60s under the Great Society policies, the fight that President Johnson had to bring into being Medicare and Medicaid, because Southern senators was using the filibuster because they didn't want hospitals to be integrated. And here we are in 2021, and Republican senators are using the same procedural tactic to impede progress, to subvert democracy, if you will. We should do away with this procedural rule. It is not in law. It is a procedure, it's custom. But our right to vote is constitutional, and we should protect the Constitution.
Is it amazing now that there still are these trick doors? There's still are these things that are being done. I mean, when we first used, it's been over 100. I mean, shoot, more than but I'll let you talk. Go ahead on that.
Wait, no, you're right. It's trick doors. But listen, I'm a Detroit Pistons fan. I know we are undefeated, right? And it's a power game,
Yeah.
right? The Bad Boys was a power game. When you got on the court with the Pistons during the tenure of the Bad Boys, you knew it was rough and tumble. You had to play. And, the refs tried to contain it, but their bench was so deep, it was hard to contain it for 4 quarters. We are in the power game. And so sometimes people want to talk about, is it fair and all these other things? Well, no, it's not fair, but it's going to be done. We have to stand up across communities and demand better, demand more to assert our power so that the minority, the small slither of individuals and corporate interests are not dominating and reigning over the majority of Americans.
I remember back, and I went to high school in San Jose, California, a school called Andrew Hill, which was extremely diverse school, but and I've always enjoyed history, but I always remember in my history class getting into it with the professor, who was a white professor, because I questioned how Columbus could have discovered a place that already had Indians living here. And he didn't like that. And I would question him about the civil rights movement and things like that, and things that weren't in the book. So I say this to say, what are your thoughts on at least 24 states banning critical race theory being taught in schools?
It's not even about the lessons being taught. It is a tool to conjure up fear and energy that the conservatives are also effective of doing. First, they want to run with defund the police, and that buzzword only went up for so far. That was followed up by critical race theory. Once this died down, there will be another buzz phrase just to generate fear and otherness and the us versus them mentality. Unfortunately, that's our political discourse. It has been that way for several years now. You think about Fox News, they really have been cutting edge and pushing that us versus them type of mentality under this concept of being a news source and their furthest thing from a news source. And then you add on top of that social media platforms, which is like a super spreader of misinformation. This time last year, the controversy of whether or not we should wear masks in the midst of COVID. That was one of the most asinine, divisive conversations we could have had in the midst of record number of people dying every month. We were talking about whether or not we should wear masks. Fear-mongering in our political discourse has been an effective tool, but fear-mongering creates such a divisive reality for far too many people. And I hate the fact that history in its totality is being challenged, just like facts are being challenged.
Yeah. The late John Lewis once said that freedom is action. What direct action do you believe is required to turn the tide in such states like Texas, Georgia, and Florida?
The Senate must adopt legislation. Action in this case is legislation. A framework to protect the rights of individuals. This is not just one or two communities. This is about our democracy. Our system of governance, our system of existing is under a direct threat. It's a frontal attack. Can you imagine when we first met, 2 years ago, had one of us said, I think in 2 years from now, there's going to be an insurrection at the United States Capitol and somebody going to walk through the Capitol building with a Confederate flag. Yeah. We'd have said, not possible. But we are at a tipping point where individuals have used so much in the realm of fear mongering that it has opened the door for a level of boldness that demystifies what we would assume would have been logic just a few years ago, few months ago. And so what we're looking at now is the necessity of the Senate to adopt public policy. That's the action to protect the rights to vote. So all of American citizens, legitimate voters, can have a voice in the direction of this nation.
I'm just curious, what was that day like for you, man? January 6th.
I was on pins and needles. It was funny. My wife and I, we went out to lunch. Um, and so we was oblivious. We didn't know what was going on. It was like right in the midst of us for the first few times going out in public to eat. It was an outdoor place, great lunch, and we get in the car and we have the satellite news on. I said, wow, something is going on at the Capitol. So I called the member of Congress and I'm talking to him, and then all of a sudden his phone went off. And we both like, wait a minute, something is wrong, right? So we get home. My oldest son is home from LA, and he was like, this is crazy. And we was like, turn television on. He's watching on his social media, turn television on. And I was floored. And so I'm trying to call the member of Congress back, and it's going straight to voicemail. I'm thinking like, this is unbelievable. Because Mark, if that was either you or I and a group of our friends in that
We wouldn't be
moment,
talking about
man,
it.
man. And then I'm thinking like, I worked on the Hill. I
Yes.
know that they have both the manpower, equipment, skill to push back on something like that. I was like, what is really going on here?
Wow.
Where's the backup? I'm like, yeah.
Well, I'm stunned and I'm not stunned, if that makes sense,
Yeah. Reading history, there's a book called Redemption, and it's called The Last Battle of the Civil War, when in fact, the Civil War had ended. And the author was talking about this period. After Reconstruction, the next period was called Redemption.
Yeah.
And the Redemption period was the result of multiple coup d'etats, insurrections. And what we've seen in January was very reminiscent of what I've read about in the book. And in the book, it talked about Colfax, Louisiana, Port Gibson, Mississippi, Yazoo City, and how these small insurrections led to coups, overthrowing local governments. It was very, very similar. It was eerie, to say the least.
Yeah, send me that book. Text me that book.
I will do. Do.
I saw that recently the NAACP is now offering to cover bail costs for the Texas Democrats facing arrest as they fight the regressive onslaught against voter rights. You said in a statement, quote, war has been declared on democracy, and we will support anyone who stands up to defend it. We are fully invested in good trouble, end quote. Obviously, good trouble is a reference to from John Lewis, who faced so much in the civil rights era. Can you place what's happening today in the larger context of history? Many have called these attacks on voting rights Jim Crow 2.0. What do you think?
I mean, it absolutely is very reminiscent. So this would be that third period after Civil War. The Union defeated the Confederacy because Africans took up arms to reinforce Sherman's army, right? No one freed us. We fought for democracy. And as a result of that reinforcement of armies, and you can read about that in many books, we were rewarded with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. That gave us citizenships, due process right, the right to negotiate for our labor, the ability to really stand up as full citizens. For the first time, African by descent American by citizenship. That's what was taken in the fight during the period of called I mentioned redemption, which was immediately followed by segregation. And segregation was no more than slavery by another name, where you paid workers low wages for their labor. And much of this is about who control the labor, who control the labor. That push was fought vigorously for many decades, and it culminated. It didn't start, but it culminated with the activities of a group of young activists, John Lewis being one of them, and Cortland Cox and Hollis Watkins and Dory Ladner. And for me, I've been in this really blessed place where I know and knew them and learned from them and worked under them. And my first job out of law school was working for Hollis Watkins, who was the first SNCC recruit in Mississippi. He and John Lewis were counterparts. Hollis with the Tougaloo, John with the Fist, Mary Berry with the Fist, Stokely Carmichael, Cortland went to Howard, all of whom I knew and would talk to and meet with. And what I'm looking at now is very similar to the stories they told. It's the fight that we must wage. That the question has always been, how do we as a community, how do this nation stand up with this promise, this social contract, and honor that contract that all men and women are endowed with certain inalienable rights. And here we are fighting vigorously to protect our rights, because there are many who are seeking to deny our rights so that an America that looked more like 1950 could reemerge, that America would never come back again.
I'm curious, when did your passion for helping Black people begin? How did it like, what was the spark? What happened where there's one thing to, go to a church and help Black folk out. It's another thing to have a life passion, a lasting passion that's gonna last longer than your last breath. Like what you're doing is pretty special. Like what sparked it?
I don't know if it was one thing, but there are like glimmers of many things. Like growing up in Detroit, I used to watch Coleman Young. When we hear that he was going to be on the news, we would go to see the news because we knew he was going to cuss on the news that night. But with that, the message behind that was to protect Detroit as an 80% Black city that was under siege by the Reagan administration, under siege by the suburban communities and the business community who really abandoned the city because it was Black. Watching Eyes on a Prize and realizing that there were a set of individuals that lacked any humanity, that they would put live dogs on children. And I remember standing on the couch, punching the air when I seen Eyes on a Prize that first time. I couldn't believe it. That was in the early 80s.
I saw it when I was about 10 years old.
Yeah, I was infuriated, getting to undergrad, Tougaloo College, historically Black school, and really reading like I had never read before, and then realizing some of the people that I was reading about were still alive and still involved, and I get to meet them and get involved. I mean, I was hooked, So it was one of those things like the first book cover for me was Fire Next Time, James Baldwin. Right. And so that first part is in two parts. I read it, I was like, okay, there was the letter to his nephew and all the warnings. Then that next part. And I was just glued to the words because he talked about that experience of growing up in Harlem and all of the hurdles in front of him and how he had to maneuver between hurdles and make decisions, in my opinion, premature for any child who's a teenager will have to make. That was my reality in Detroit. And being able to see the suffering and realize that so many people were in predicaments and situations that they should have never been in. And that somebody had to be the voice to speak for those who could not speak for themselves.
Well, God bless you, man. You recently tweeted out something quite interesting. Quote, democracy is not about race, but people will use race to subvert democracy. Break that down for me.
If you sit back and you look at electioneering, oftentimes the messages of fear, they have words that embed racism and xenophobia and otherness. So the debate around immigration and we don't want them to come take our jobs. It's about race to engender a level of fear, to catapult individuals to vote oftentimes against their interests. The whole conversation around critical race theory is about fear, to try to capture and energize a conservative base around fear so they can justify tax policy that actually hurt the very people that they want to, embolden, which has always been like, okay, this is masterful that people are able to use language to motivate the masses to operate outside of their interests.
Yeah.
And race has been the centerpiece of that otherness. Morality is used sometimes, but race in this country have been the primary driver of the conversation.
What can the average person do to get involved with the NAACP? And are there any marches or large-scale plans for for the NAACP in the near future?
Well, it's one of those scenarios where we are the largest rights organization in the country. We're in 47 states. We're in local neighborhoods everywhere.
What states are you not in?
Well, I don't have many cousins in Montana, South Dakota,
okay,
and Idaho.
Okay, continue.
All right. Yeah, so now, if you got relatives, now let us know. We do have a unit, ironically, in North Dakota, but not South Dakota.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Alaska and Hawaii, all over the places. We also, many of our activists are volunteers, and we really practice and believe in small D democracy, that individuals can come to the table and have a voice equal to every member in the table. And we encourage that. That's important. In terms of marches, it all depends on where in the country you may exist. At any given point, there could be some type of direct action in a community near you, depending on the issues the members in that community take on. And that's the beautiful thing about the NAACP. We're not a connectional church where a bishop sit up high and sit an edict and everybody conform. But we're bottom-up structure with members and units and activities all across, and depend on the season. We have members abroad. We have military bases where we organize. We have individuals in the African diaspora that are affinity to the NAACP. In fact, you may not know this, but when the ANC was being formed, they consulted with the NAACP around their bylaws and the formation.
Wow.
ANC in terms of the African National Congress in South Africa, and that's about Dallas. So yeah.
I want to see if you could talk about your hopes to cancel student debt. Where does that stand right now? And I got some student debt I need help on, so I'm all with this.
And you like most, right? We have so many individuals who are first and second generation college goers, and what happened over the last 15, the cost of higher ed doubled, and the student loan debt rate doubled. You cannot discharge student loan in bankruptcy. And so we have a whole generation of highly capable, highly competent individuals across all racial lines who are being strangled under a pool of debt. And much of that is owned by the federal government. Yeah. It is one of those scenarios. We have given in corporate tax breaks more money in multiples than the amount of student loan debt owed.
Wow.
So if you want to jumpstart the economy, if you want to build wealth, free people from student loans, therefore their credit debt ratio opens up and they can do large purchases like homes. They can really save, they can start a business, but on average, you're talking about individuals paying $300 to $500 a month, and a lot of people paying far more than that if you have, a grad or professional degree.
Yeah.
And so what we're saying to the administration, because you don't even need congressional action, if you have individuals who qualify under the public service student forgiveness program. These are government employees that work for municipalities, that work for school districts, teachers, state, federal. The program already exists. Make it more readily available for people to qualify. And as opposed to 10 years, shorten it to 3 years like we did for doctors for many years ago and serve in underserved communities. That would free up so many teachers and they would be better able to perform. One of the pieces that are being pushed by Elizabeth Warren and Senator Schumer is cancel student loan debt up to $50,000. We support that as well. Why? Because you have a whole group of individuals who didn't finish college and they are employed in professions where they'll never be able to pay it off. Yeah. They're making payments, they never pay it off. And so it should be addressed. And then thirdly, for-profit predators schools like Trump universities and those. The Department of Education allow for far too many of our community, and this is not just black, white, green, it's everyone, to be exploited by these for-profit colleges who came in, marketed to targeted segment of the community like military veterans or current those in the military, and had them max out their student loans and Pell Grant, and they are stuck. And they were getting degrees in nail tech, degrees that would never be marketable. They weren't even accredited. The federal government allowed that to happen. And so we're seeing more and more of those schools not only being shut down, but students who were schemed, that being forgiven.
I hope that happens sooner rather than later. I would love that. You have said that meaningful attempt to erase the radical wealth gap must begin with attacking student debt. What do you think else is required beyond student debt? What else is on that list to help, debt?
So the racial wealth gap is almost like a domino. For many years, and it still exists today, the number one accelerator of wealth is home ownership. Can't own a home if you have an income debt ratio that's too high. Yeah. The largest amount of debt in our community is student loans. And so I'm starting with the domino chip so we can get to closing the gap. Entrepreneurship is a great accelerator to wipe out the wealth gap. But entrepreneurs need capital. And it's hard to get capital if your credit rating is poor. And if your credit rating is poor, oftentimes because of the debt that you previously owned, and the number one piece of debt is student loans. You see, it's all connected.
Yeah. Last week we had an opportunity on Beyond 28 to speak with Supervisor Shamann Walton. I don't know if you've met him. He's president of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. One of his signature pieces of legislation was passing of a bill that would appoint a task force to study the feasibility of awarding San Franciscans who were descendants of slavery reparations. I'm curious to how the NAACP feels about fighting for reparations.
Oh,
do you think it's even possible?
I think anything is possible if there's political will, and we've been supportive of this ever since John Conyers introduced the HR 40 some 50 years ago before his death. Amos Brown, our branch president in San Francisco, he's excited. I think he's actually on the commission. We are in support, and it's always been the case because we have to understand that when there is state and federal sanctioned harm and injury, there must be state and federal repairing from that injury. That is a part of our, should be a part of our system. And the harm that many of not only our descendants, but actually our kids are still suffering, it is a part of the public policy barriers that were put in place, structural racism, that have truly impeded much in terms of progress. It's a great book that's out, written by Dr. Andre Perry. I was trying to put my hands on it. It's called Know Your Value. And in the book, he really talked about growing up in Pittsburgh and how he loved his community and all of the things that was taking place. I'm looking around, I can't think of the title all of a sudden, and how that he went back some years later and how devalued and depressed everything was. It's called Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America. Right? It's a great book. And he tracks growing up and then coming back and realized the bottom had fell out. And the community just outside of Pittsburgh that he was living in was considered the nice community, only for over 10, 15 years, industries moved out because so many Black people moved in, and the property value depleted. And when the property value depletes, then there's not the revenue for the school, and the school are unable to provide the level of quality equal to any other school because it's based on property value. You see the domino goes from there. Those are all structural decisions. Why are we funding schools based on property tax? Inherently, you create a dual system, particularly when you intentionally lock out communities from certain people from certain communities, and you lock in other areas, and you depress the value because the valuation of property is so subjective. Yeah. And so you create structure. There has to be repairing of that intentional harm, because intentional. I talked about Social Security. That was a structural barrier, structural racism, where our families did not have the benefit of Social Security safety net for decades, because Southern legislators, segregationists, was able to get a carve out the bill that domestic and agricultural workers would be exempt because they didn't want to pay into the Social Security system for their cheap labor. Or when the federal home mortgage program came into being, that bankers and developers was able to have an exception pulled out that the decision of who will qualify for these federally backed home mortgages will be left up to the local banking community. Subjective test, therefore, it gave rise to redlining of who can get loans where and who couldn't. Yeah, so absolutely we support it.
So I got one more NAACP question, but I'm gonna lead this with a basketball question.
Okay.
All right. So I know you're curious about the basketball question, but I got one more deep question for you. And thank you. It's been over a year since the massive protests that swept this nation in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Looking back at this past year, what in your mind has changed as a result or has improved, and what has gotten worse?
What I thought was phenomenal in reaction was that the many individuals who took to the street in peaceful protest under the value proposition of Black Lives Matter. It looked like America. It was Black and white, young and old, male, female. And it was the largest statement of solidarity that this country has seen. And the value proposition wasn't about an organization or a hashtag. It was to say that George Floyd, life matters. Mark, let your life matter, let my life matter. And so many people's life matter. And that that the inhumanity that was displayed is unacceptable.
Yes.
And the fact that that took place, that I think that's a step forward. What's most frustrating, it goes back to the John Lewis quote you said earlier that this guy has to be action. We still don't have that federal legislation to hold police officers accountable. We still don't have a publicly facing database of police misconduct. We still have not right-sized the question of how to change the culture of policing. That must be done. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see incidents and episodes of Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, or you name the atrocities that we have over the last 5 years been witnessing because people captured it on social media.
Supervisor, in a recent interview, you described the specific inequities experienced by San Franciscans, stating that in San Francisco, we can look at the negative effects of the redlining, the out-migration and redevelopment pushing out families and businesses, know that true reparations are owed to the Black community because we helped to build this country, and in doing so, provided hundreds of years of free labor. It's time to do something to amend that, and reparations are on the way. Can you unpack for me and our listeners the impact that these payments will have on the issues you mentioned above?
Well, first of all, Bill, I think people really have to understand what happened to us as Black people here in this country, which spilled over to us as Black folks in San Francisco. When you take someone from their country, you take away their language, you take away their name, you take away their ability to reproduce, you take away their ability to receive an education, and you make them work, and they work for free, and you get rich off of their labor, and they were never provided with real opportunities. That is a recipe to make sure that a wealth gap exists. That is a recipe to make sure that there is no possible way that population of folks could receive equity. And so the only way to do that is through reparations and to provide folks with the things that you owe. And that's why reparations is so important, and that's why we continue to fight for reparations, because of all of the negative impacts that have happened throughout history. And so it's the same thing here in San Francisco. When we look at redlining and being pushed out and over criminalization, folks have never been given an opportunity to address the gaps in wealth that exists here in San Francisco, particularly Black people. Never been provided the opportunity at the same level of home ownership, never been provided the same opportunities in terms of education, and that starts from pre-K and preschool all the way through 12th grade and even into higher education. And so reparations is the only way to right those wrongs and to reverse those negative impacts. And we have to provide true home ownership. We have to provide the access and opportunity for education at all levels for Black people. We have to address the things that lead to over-criminalization and really make an attack at systemic racism, because the main thing that needs to happen from this reparations plan and reparations package from the task force is we have to truly address that wealth gap and make sure that we do something and put something in place for Black people in San Francisco to be able to build generational wealth. Because that's what slavery did to us. That's what happened with redlining. That's what happened with the out-migration. It took away our ability to build generational wealth and make sure that we leave a place for our children and our children's children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, and leave that type of legacy. And obviously it's not always just about money, because we've lost a lot of culture over the years. When you separate people and take them out of their habitat and move them around, you lose a lot of culture with that as well. And so we have to do everything we can to rebuild that and to bring that back, and to make sure that our young people and our future generations have that opportunity to not only achieve the generational wealth, but have the opportunity to experience culture the way some of us have, and of course even more so the way some of our ancestors have.
I'm curious, man. How did supervisor? How did you get into politics, and who were your biggest mentors coming up?
Well, my biggest mentor is Fillmore Graham, and you'll see his picture right behind me. He started the Omega Boys Club back in 1966 in Vallejo, California. And when I moved from the city to Vallejo, he was one of those mentors that just stood by me, in and out of juvenile hall, being expelled from school. He never gave up on me and hundreds of other youth, as well as Dr. Marshall here at the Omega Boys Club in San Francisco, who, when I had the opportunity, fortunately, to go to college, made sure that my tuition was paid so that I didn't have to struggle and suffer being from a single parent home where my mom did everything she could. But I said that to say that I grew up a certain way, had mentorship, which was very important for me. But the biggest thing I always wanted to do was be able to affect change. And every job I had after undergrad led me to working with young people or working with families. And every time you work with young people and work with families, you try to do everything you can and you hit a roadblock. And then it's like, what's the next thing I can do to help my community and to improve some of the situations? And, it became to the point where, well, you're upset and you're frustrated with the systems that be. You have concerns and issues. So why don't you work hard to be in a place where you can help make some of those decisions, where you can help think through some of those problems and do something effective for our people. And after leading a couple of organizations and working for City and County of San Francisco, I ran for the Board of Education while I was the executive director at Young Community Developers. And a lot of our young people who were coming through our doors that didn't have a GED or who were looking for jobs, part of their bad experience or negative experience that led them to our doorstep was the experiences that they didn't receive or didn't have within the school district. And so I wanted to work and make sure we put policies in place that set our young people up for success and created learning environments that got them excited about learning and address their individual needs. And as you do that, working hard within the school district, setting policy for our young folks, also running a workforce organization in Bayview Hunters Point, where we're making a lot of connections for folks in the job world, but it's still more things that need to be done. And I figure we can make a bigger impact for a community on the Board of Supervisors if my community would have me. And we were fortunate enough to win and be able to make change through the legislative process, which I think is very important. And we're going to continue to fight to do that. And if just as we talk about this conversation, it's humbling to be in this role, but we wouldn't even have the opportunity to put a reparations task force legislation together if we weren't on the board. And so always been about affecting change and trying to find ways to better my community, and this is one way to do it through policy. And it's humbling and exciting to be in this position.
Yeah, I wanted to switch gears for a moment and talk to you about the larger theme of this episode, which is freedom. In the context of our discussion on reparations as well as the stands you've taken against police abuse and other issues, what do you think freedom looks like for San Francisco's African American community in 2021?
What it looks like or what it should look like?
What it should look like.
Well, I think the first thing in San Francisco, one, freedom should look like Black people all over San Francisco, right? We are a segregated city. A lot of people don't understand that and know that. The small Black population that exists is really concentrated in one area, and so freedom looks like Black people all over San Francisco and all 11 districts enjoying the city. Freedom looks like us being able to move about freely without people wanting to call the police on us because our daughters are at a lemonade stand or because we might be walking through a certain community just doing our daily jobs. That's what freedom looks like for us. Being able to be a part of a city, be able to contribute to the city, but also being able to receive the benefits of a city like San Francisco. All the resources and opportunity that exists here should be equitable for Black population, and that's not the case. We are held from so many opportunities, whether it's so many types of jobs, whether it's opportunities to navigate a certain way throughout San Francisco. Freedom looks like the police not bothering you because of the color of your skin or because of reputation of a community that you may be in. And we have a long way to go to achieve all of that. But most definitely, I think one of the major components of freedom here is in San Francisco is to be allowed to raise your family, to be allowed to do the things that you want in the communities or in the areas of San Francisco that exist without anyone trying to take away that opportunity. And so whether it's the police, whether it's through policies that keep us out of certain areas and communities here in San Francisco, whether it's the fact that unemployment rate is higher for us, the fact that a lot of the negative health impacts are higher for us, we have to address all of those things to achieve real freedom here and real equity in San Francisco for Black people.
Yeah. Now, I remember last year, man, reading the San Francisco Chronicle, and I think this movement sparked by you and certainly made headlines nationwide. But last summer you were the driving force behind the passage of the Caren Act, Caren Act, which would outlaw racially motivated calls into San Francisco. It's the Caution Against Racially Exploitative Non-Emergencies Act, which would subject people who called 911 based on racial bias to a civil penalty. Um, since this has gone into effect, have you seen any change, any drop off in these calls, and what kind of effect has it had on San Francisco?
I would love to say that the passage of the Caren Act stopped people from discriminating against Black people and discriminating against people of color, but that's actually not the case. Just last week, we had a young Latino male in a community, and two white women decided that he shouldn't be there and attempted to question him. And this is a teenager, and it really violated him, and it really caused strain and stress for this young man, because all he was doing is going about his day-to-day daily business. And so some of the Latino community and some of the community protested in that area to let people know that we're not going to stand for that type of discrimination. I think about a month ago here in San Francisco, we had a male who was trying to doing his job, just delivering in the community in Pacific Heights. And a white male approached him and asked him what he was doing in the neighborhood, told him he didn't belong there. And all this is caught on video. Yeah. So you would think with the false accusations where people are trying to cause harm to Black people while they're out in Central Park, or when girls at the lemonade stand, or when Black people are barbecuing, or when a Filipino man is spray painting Black Lives Matter on his own home. These things are well documented. People have lost jobs. People have had their careers ruined. And you still see some people who, unfortunately, are going to let their prejudice and racism override common sense decision making and letting people be and live and enjoy the communities they're in. But the Caren Act, I think, will be a deterrence. I think that we're going to continue to make sure that it's known and get information out so folks know what the Caren Act is and that it exists. There's also state law that was passed by Assemblymember Rob Bonta before he became Attorney General that addresses similar calls for protected classes. And we're just going to continue to do everything we can as a policymaker to stop and fight discrimination and racism. And the Caren Act has been one tool to do that. Hopefully, we don't get to a point where it has to be used, because that means that somebody was harmed from a racist and frivolous 911 call, and there's a civil penalty involved for at least $1,000, and it could be up to whatever amount. But the point is, once the Caren Act is put in place, that means somebody was violated and somebody was harmed, and that's what we don't want, right? This is the reason why we put things like that in place, and it's sad that we have to have laws that say, you can't call the police to harm people just because of your prejudices. I mean, look at the the woman, I don't want to go too deep into this, that accused that young black man of stealing her telephone.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
like this is a week later or so, right? Like,
yeah.
I mean, just the fear some people have, or the hatred, or the prejudice against black people, and it's just so disheartening that we have to deal with that, and that we have to come up with a law like the Caren Act to work to try to curtail some of the these calls and these racist acts. But it's devastating. This young man here in San Francisco who had to deal with those two women telling him he didn't belong, and questioning him like that, it's going to impact him for a while.
Yeah.
And that's the sad part about it.
Man, I just thinking about it, but I swear, and I'm guessing it's the same thing for you. I've had about 5 or 6 incidents from the past race through my head right now, man, which is sad, very, very sad. And I hope your movement catches fire, man, and definitely makes a nationwide difference. So kudos to you
Well,
on that.
people keep catching things on social media. I like to think that that has led to some of the changes that we see. The fact that we can pass a Caren Act and get people supportive of laws like that. The fact that, we know about police brutality and about black people and people of color being killed at the hands of law enforcement, and we're talking about unarmed people for a long time. But being captured on social media, being captured on video, I think has definitely led to changes. We got a long way to go, but most certainly we're starting to see more officers prosecuted. Most certainly we're starting to see some officers convicted, where in years past these folks would have not even um, been prosecuted and charges would not have been filed. We're not there yet because people are still getting away with being above the law, but we're going to keep fighting and keep exposing this type of racism and hatred.
Yeah, respect, man. Um, all across the nation, there is an assault on our history and legacy. This is most visible in the misguided and misinformed attack on critical race theory and other teachings. Professors and school boards are being targeted, and there is major funding from conservative groups who seek to make this a wedge issue in the 2022 election. How have these issues affected the discussion of critical race theory in San Francisco schools, and how will you make sure students continue to have the facts about their history taught without political interference?
Well, I think that as we talk about critical race theory, a lot of people are still learning and trying to understand what that is. I will say here in San Francisco, we now have an ethnic studies program that's being built out, and there's a focus in the school district on that, and focus on making sure that all parts of history are taught, particularly the parts of history that black people never got to learn growing up in your typical textbooks. And so I think here in the city, folks are actually excited about being able to provide the education and telling it like it is in terms of history for black people, so we can do things better to help make change and not repeat the cycles that existed in history. But across the country, it's working, right? Something that Trump did was create divisions across all parties and create divisions across all races, and he did it in a systematic way, to where even people who don't share his views, unfortunately, because of their hate and because of their racism, they'll work on and build off of his division. And so we have to remind folks that all parts of history are something that need to be known and need to be taught, particularly in the case where we're talking about repairing damage and we're talking about providing opportunities for equity. Have to know the history that you come from, so that those same mistakes aren't repeated. And you have to tell history in a way that is not fabricated. Things are not made up, and it's really the truth about what has happened to a people or what has happened to a culture, and that's important. So critical race theory, I do not believe, will be a dividing factor here in San Francisco, but most certainly it's already happening across the country in some states, and particularly states below the Mason-Dixon line. And we still see so many remnants of what took place during slavery and immediately after slavery in the red states and in the South. And we just have to keep educating folks, keep communicating with folks to get folks to understand that one, hate is not going to work, but two, it's just so powerful, and we got to do everything we can to combat it.
Yeah, I kind of touched on this a little bit before, but obviously a major issue in San Francisco continues to be gentrification. The African American population is half of what it was in 1970, and the black middle class has largely left the city. How do you view gentrification right now, and can any of it be reversed to be beneficial for the black community in the city?
Yeah, I mean, gentrification is, it's a sad thing to see. If you look at, I don't know if you ever saw The Last Black Man in San Francisco.
Yeah, I did see that.
You know,
Yeah.
a big part of the movie, the main star was connected to this house that his grandfather had, and I had similar experiences growing up, where my great aunts owned homes out here, and we would spend Easters and Thanksgivings and Christmases over at these homes. And as they passed on and families sold houses, I'm in a situation now where I don't have any blood family here in San Francisco that owns a home.
Wow.
So I want to think about that. The majority of my family migrated from Louisiana to San Francisco, and we had home ownership. We had a thriving population for my family, and now again I have no family members that own homes here in San Francisco, and so that's telling of my experience, but it's similar for so many other people. And it's a problem because can you imagine an entire city 100% depleted of any race, 100% depleted of black people? And that's what gentrification is doing. And like I said before, we have small pockets of black population in the Western Addition in Fillmore and Lakeview, and to a larger extent in Bayview. But we have worked to do things like provide neighborhood preferences, so when certain new housing, affordable housing is built, black folks have an opportunity and a preference to move in. We also have right to return legislation in place for certain areas that are being revitalized and rebuilt, so that when that new housing comes along, folks who lived there before, mainly black people, have an opportunity to move back. Again, additional preferences for certificate of preference holders. So we're doing what we can from a policy standpoint, also working to make sure that more jobs and more opportunities exist in the city that are appealing to black people, and doing a better job with the education system, because those are the things that are going to bring people back. And I have a major fight to make sure I do everything to keep people here that remain in San Francisco, and make sure that they have the job opportunities, the training opportunities, the education. And that's another piece and another reason why our reparations is so major. Also, Mayor Breed and I redirected $120 million over the next 2 years from the police department to invest in the black community. And that addresses workforce development, home ownership. It addresses health and wellness and arts and culture. But these resources are provided to organizations that are black-led for black people, and making sure that we address a lot of the negative impacts through those resources. So $60 million for this fiscal year, next year, are going directly to the black community, on top of all the other things that we're providing. But it's important that we do everything we can to maintain the population that we do have as well.